The first sound was a lie. It was a low, almost gentle hum that vibrated through the packed earth of the walls, a sound Abigail Morgan had come to associate with peace. But outside, the world was screaming. The wind, a physical thing now on the third day, was scouring the high plains of Providence Flats, carrying with it a payload of ice and snow so fine it was more like sand. Inside the burrow, the air was still and warm, smelling of dried herbs, dog, and the slow, steady heat radiating from the clay and stone stove. Her German shepherd, Kaiser, lay with his head on his paws, his breathing a quiet rhythm against the floor. He hadn't paced in hours. The cast-iron kettle on the stove whispered, its steam a stark contrast to the frozen desolation just a few feet above their heads. The thermometer she had hung next to the door, a precise German instrument her late husband had prized, read a steady 18 degrees Celsius. Outside, she knew, it was -30, and dropping. The snow had started as a novelty, a picturesque dusting. Now, it was a predator. She could no longer see out the thick, triple-paned glass window set deep into the southern face of the hill. It was a wall of white, the pressure of a 3-meter drift pressing against it. Yet the glass held, its frame anchored directly into the unforgiving geology of the bluff. Any other window in the valley would have been shattered by the wind or crushed by the weight. But this was not any other window, and this was not any other home. It was Morgan's Folly. The Gopher Hole. The Widow's Burrow. The names had been many, none of them kind. Now, as the blizzard entered its 72nd hour, it was the only structure for 50 kilometers that wasn't fighting for its life. It was simply existing. It wasn't a fortress resisting a siege, it was a part of the hill itself, and the hill did not care about the storm. How did a lone widow, a woman who arrived with little more than a good dog, a wagon of books, and a set of surveyor's tools, come to build the one thing that could survive this? Why was she ready when an entire town, full of proud men who built with thick lumber and square nails, was being erased from the map? The answer wasn't in the storm itself, but in the quiet, deliberate months that came before it. Months earlier, the air had been thick with the scent of pine sawdust and the promise of expansion. Providence Flats was a town built on confidence, a grid of straight lines and right angles laid over a landscape that had none. When Abigail Morgan arrived, her wagon drawn by 2 sturdy mules, she was an object of quiet curiosity. A widow, alone but not forlorn, with a calm, assessing gaze that seemed to take in the geology of the surrounding bluffs more than the faces of the people. She went to the land office, where Agent Miller spread a map across his desk. The prime lots were in the valley, near the creek, flat and easy to build on. He pointed to them with a proprietary finger. "This here is the Sterling Ranch expansion," he'd said, indicating a vast swathe of grassland. "And the town board set aside this parcel for the new church. There's a good piece here." Flat as a griddle, Abigail had barely glanced at it. Her eyes were on the contoured lines at the edge of the map, a place the town ignored. A steep, south-facing bluff pocked with rock outcroppings and covered in scrub cedar. "That one," she said, her voice even. Section 14, the southern slope. Miller had blinked, adjusting his spectacles. That's grazing land at best. And poor at that. Can't plow it. Can't build on it proper. The wind comes over that ridge." Something fierce. Abigail had merely nodded, as if he were confirming a fact she already knew. "That is the piece I want." The transaction was viewed as the first sign of an unstable mind. Why would anyone choose a difficult, rocky hillside over a piece of perfectly good, flat earth? When she filed the claim, paying in solid currency that silenced further official protest, the whispers began. Rancher Sterling, a man whose wealth was measured in cattle and flat acreage, saw her directing her mules up the slope. He'd ridden over, his saddle creaking like the voice of authority. He'd boomed, not unkindly, "There's been a mistake. This land is worthless. You can't run a herd on a 45-degree angle." She'd looked up at him from the base of the bluff, her gaze traveling up the slope to a specific spot she had already marked with a pile of stones. "I am not raising cattle, Mr. Sterling. I am raising a home." The remark, repeated later in the town saloon, drew hearty laughter. The widow was not just eccentric, she was a fool. The digging began a week later. It was not the shallow scrape of a root cellar or the simple rectangle of a foundation. Abigail, dressed in her late husband's sturdy work trousers and a linen shirt, set to work with a pickaxe and shovel, Kaiser watching from a patch of shade. She wasn't just clearing a space, she was carving into the hillside itself. The town builder, a man named Davies whose reputation was staked on the sturdy, two-story frame houses he built, came to watch. He stood with his arms crossed, a gesture of professional skepticism. He called out, his voice laced with the condescension of an expert. If you're planning a cellar, you're starting it in the wrong place. You want it under the house, not out here in the open. Abigail paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her glove. She gestured with her shovel at the growing hollow in the earth. This is not the cellar, Mr. Davies. This is the house. Davies had stared, then let out a short, sharp laugh. A dugout? My God, woman, this isn't the sod-busting days. We build with timber in Providence Flats. We build proper houses that stand up to the sky, not holes to hide in. He was the authority on shelter, a man who understood mortise and tenon, king posts and rafters. His dismissal was considered the final verdict. The name was coined that afternoon. Morgan's Folly, he'd called it, and the name stuck. The mockery wasn't loud or cruel, but it was pervasive, like the constant prairie wind. It came in the form of offered help that was really a critique, of sideways glances in the general store, of children daring each other to run up the hill and peek into the crazy widow's cave. Preacher Albright stopped by, Bible in hand, to gently suggest that God intended for man to live on the earth, not within it like the beasts of the field. It is a matter of dignity, Mrs. Morgan, he'd explained, his face a mask of sincere concern. Through it all, Abigail remained placid. She listened to their warnings and their wisdom, nodded politely, and then picked up her shovel and went back to work. The earth has a better memory for warmth than the air does, was all she said to Davies once, a simple statement of thermal physics that he dismissed as folk nonsense. That hole is where I want it. Her method was not brute force, but a patient conversation with the land. Her husband had been a mining engineer, a man who read rock and soil the way others read books, and he had taught her everything. She didn't just dig, she observed. She followed the strata of clay and shale, using the natural layers to her advantage. The main chamber was dug 4 meters deep into the hillside, a rectangle 7 meters long and 5 meters wide. She didn't use dynamite. Instead, she used leverage, water, and an understanding of fracture lines. Days were spent finding the grain of the rock and splitting it with wedges. It was slow, arduous work, punctuated by the rhythmic clang of steel on stone. Kaiser was her constant companion, his presence a silent, steadying force. He would lie at the edge of the excavation, watching her, his ears perked, occasionally letting out a low growl when a coyote ventured too close. The town saw a woman digging a hole. They didn't see the careful shoring with thick cedar posts harvested from the ridge behind her, placed not vertically but at a slight angle to counter the immense pressure of the earth. They didn't see her lining the walls with a thick layer of blue clay, dug from a deposit she had located 50 yards away, which she mixed with straw and painstakingly applied as a waterproof barrier. She was creating not a cave, but a vessel. Each day, she would consult her husband's journals, filled with sketches of geological formations and notes on the structural integrity of different types of soil. She wasn't just following his instructions, she understood the principles behind them. The design was deceptively simple. The back and side walls were the earth itself. The front, facing south, was where the timber and glass would go. She hired 2 young men from the town to help her raise the main beams for the roof, heavy timber she had traded for with a lumber mill 50 miles east. They worked for a day, snickering to each other about the absurdity of it, took her money, and left shaking their heads. Davies, riding by, had shouted, "You're building the roof first." "That's backwards." Abigail simply pointed to the massive earthen walls. "The walls have been here for 1,000 years, she replied. "I think they'll hold." It was a home built from a different kind of logic, a logic born of observation, not tradition. The genius of the folly was not in its walls, but in its systems. It was designed to breathe. After the main chamber was secure, she began a new, more delicate excavation. Using a hand auger and smaller shovels, she carved 2 narrow shafts. The first went straight up 9 meters through the soil and rock to the surface of the bluff above, lined with clay pipe. This was her chimney, but its function was more complex than a simple flue. At its base, she constructed a stove from fieldstone, soapstone, and clay, a massive, blocky affair that dominated one corner of the room. It was a masonry heater, designed not for a roaring fire but for a slow, efficient burn that would heat the entire stone mass. This thermal battery would then radiate heat for 12 to 18 hours after the fire had died out. The second shaft was an air intake, dug from the floor of the main chamber and running horizontally 50 feet out to the north, opening in a sheltered spot among the rocks. This brought in fresh, cold, oxygen-rich air directly to the stove's firebox, meaning she never had to open a door or window in winter and create a draft. The system was self-regulating, a closed loop of intake and exhaust that kept the interior air fresh and the heat contained. The entrance was another piece of engineering. Instead of a door opening directly into the main room, she built a small, sunken anteroom, a cold trap. Any frigid air that managed to get through the heavy outer door would pool in this lower space, unable to breach the inner door into the warmer living area. And then there was the window. It was her one great expense, a custom-made triple-pane unit hauled by freight wagon from a city 200 miles away. She set it deep into the south-facing timber wall, angled slightly to catch the low winter sun. From the first frost of autumn to the last of spring, the sun would pour directly into the chamber, heating the dark stone floor and the massive stove, a passive solar gain that provided a huge portion of her heat for free. It was more than just a shelter. It was a system, each part working with the others, all of it designed to cooperate with the environment, not defy it. It was a home that harnessed the sun, borrowed the earth's insulation, and tamed the wind. The first test came in late October. A norther blew in, not a blizzard, but a vicious storm with heavy, wet snow and winds that tore shingles from the roofs in Providence Flats. For 3 days, the town hunkered down, stoves burning through cordwood at an alarming rate. Smoke poured from every chimney, a frantic signal of consumption. From Abigail's chimney, however, there was only a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke for an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. That was all it took to heat the masonry stove. Sterling, losing 2 calves to the wet cold, grumbled that the widow was probably freezing in her hole, too proud to ask for help. Davy spent a day repairing a porch ripped away by the wind, cursing the storm. Inside the folly, Abigail sat reading by the light of her big window, Kaiser asleep at her feet. The temperature inside never dropped below 17 degrees. She used, by her careful calculation, about 70% less wood than a traditional cabin of the same size would have. The storm passed, and the town's opinion of her solidified. She was a hardy eccentric, perhaps, but still a fool. Her home was a curiosity, not a model. The following Sunday, Preacher Albright delivered a sermon on the Tower of Babel. He didn't mention her by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. He spoke of the folly of pride, of new and strange ways that turned from the traditions of their fathers, of seeking comfort in the dirt instead of in the grace of God and the community of man. Abigail sat in the back pew, her face impassive. She left without a word. As November deepened, she felt a change. It was a stillness she had learned to recognize from her husband's teachings. The birds went quiet. The usual chatter of sparrows and jays vanished. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, growing thin and sharp. A high, pale haze veiled the sun. One evening, Kaiser, who normally slept soundly, became restless. He paced the length of the room, his claws ticking on the stone floor. He would stop, lift his head, and taste the air coming from the intake vent, a low whine in his throat. Abigail laid a hand on his neck. "I know," she whispered. She went outside, into the profound, biting silence. The sky was not cloudy, but a flat, ominous sheet of grey. There was no wind. It was the deepest, most unsettling calm she had ever felt. The calm of a held breath, waiting to be released in a scream. The scream came just before dawn. It started as a low moan in the west, a sound that made the very air vibrate. Abigail was already awake. She had spent the last hour securing the outer door, banking the stove with dense oak, and ensuring the ventilation shafts were clear of debris. She brought the last of her firewood inside, stacking it neatly against the wall. The temperature, which had been -10 at midnight, had plummeted to -25. The first snowflakes were not flakes at all, but tiny, hard pellets of ice that pinged against the glass of her window. In Providence Flats, the town was stirring, men cursing the sudden, bone-deep cold as they lit their stoves. They saw the snow and thought it was just another squall. An hour later, the moan became a roar. The wind hit the valley like a physical blow, a solid wall of force that stripped the last leaves from the cottonwoods in a single gust. The snow didn't fall. It attacked, driving horizontally, erasing the world in a blast of white. Inside the burrow, Abigail felt the first impact as a deep thrum that passed through the hillside. The light from her window dimmed, then dimmed further as the snow began to accumulate. Kaiser lay by the inner door, no longer whining, but watchful and still. His calm was her barometer. In town, the initial confidence curdled into concern. Davies checked the joints on his own house, proud of their tightness, yet he could feel the cold forcing its way through the walls. Sterling rode out to check his herd, his face raw in seconds, and saw his prize bull leaning against a fence, already encased in a sheath of ice. He barely made it back to his ranch house, the world having vanished behind him. The fight had begun. Every house in Providence Flats was an island, battling the cold, the wind, and the endless snow. Stoves devoured wood. Draft snaked in through every crack. The buildings, designed to stand up to the sky, were now fully exposed to its wrath, their vertical walls acting as sails against the gale, their angled roofs providing purchase for the immense, accumulating weight of the snow. Abigail's home did the opposite. The wind screamed over the top of the bluff, hardly touching the sunken entrance. The snow, far from being a threat, was becoming an ally, piling over the roof and against the exposed front wall, adding its insulating value to the earth's. By day 5, Providence Flats was a ghost town buried in a tomb of white. The snow was 3, then 45, then 6 meters deep in the valley, a rolling ocean of powder that had swallowed fences, wagons, and entire outbuildings. The wind had not ceased for a moment. Inside the Sterling Ranch house, a place of wealth and warmth, the family was huddled in a single room, blankets piled high, the furniture broken up and fed into the fireplace. Their massive woodpile was buried and inaccessible. The day before, they had heard a sound like thunder, a deep, wrenching crack. It was the roof of their new barn, the one that had cost $3,000, collapsing under a load it was never designed to bear. 40 head of prize cattle were gone. Davies, the master builder, sat in his own kitchen, listening to the house groan. The wind had shattered 2 of his north-facing windows, despite the shutters. He had boarded them up from the inside, but the cold was relentless. His wife was ill, her breathing shallow. He had built his house to be a monument to his craft, but he had miscalculated the enemy. He had built for gravity and rain, not for a horizontal assault and a crushing, static load. His home was losing. The groans from the timbers were becoming sharper, the pops more frequent. He was listening to his own pride breaking. In Morgan's Folly, the routine was unchanged. Abigail rose, tended the stove, made coffee, and portioned out food for herself and Kaiser. The light from the window was gone completely, a faint, diffuse glow at its center the only indication of the buried world outside. The silence was absolute, save for the whisper of the kettle and the soft crackle from the stove. The storm was no longer a sound, it was a pressure, a weight. But inside, it was sanctuary. The earth around them held its temperature, a vast reservoir of thermal stability. The snow piled against the front was no longer a drift but a blanket, its R-value adding to the deep, quiet peace. She was not burning through her woodpile. A single slow-burning log in the morning and one at night was enough to keep the stone mass of the heater radiating a gentle, pervasive warmth. She was not surviving. She was living. While the town fought a war of attrition against the cold, Abigail Morgan was simply waiting, warm and secure in the heart of the hill. On the morning of the 7th day, the wind stopped. The silence it left behind was more profound and unnerving than the roar had been. Abigail waited another full day, letting the air settle, before she attempted to leave. It took her 2 hours with her sturdy shovel to clear a narrow tunnel up from her sunken doorway to the new surface of the world. When she finally emerged, blinking in the impossibly bright sunlight reflecting off the snow, the landscape was unrecognizable. It was a sea of white, sculpted by the wind into alien shapes. The only landmark was the thin plume of smoke rising from her own chimney stack, a single, defiant signal of life in a world erased. She was standing on 6 meters of snow. The tops of the tallest trees in the valley were mere bushes. Of Providence Flats, there was nothing. No roofs, no chimneys, no sign of the straight, proud lines of the town. There was only the snow. She stood there for a long time, Kaiser at her side, his body pressed against her leg. Then, in the distance, she saw movement. A figure, stumbling, falling, rising again, making a desperate line for the only sign of human existence. It was Davies. His face was a mask of frostbite and exhaustion, his eyes hollowed out by what he had seen. He collapsed a few feet from her, his breath coming in ragged sobs. "The roofs, they're all gone," he gasped, his voice cracking. "The weight." "I never figured for the weight." He looked past her, at the simple, solid structure of her entrance, at the smoke rising from the chimney. His professional pride, the foundation of his entire life, was shattered. He looked at her, and for the first time, he did not see a fool. He saw an architect. "I've been building houses to fight the prairie," he said, his voice filled with a terrible, dawning clarity. "You built one that cooperates with it." He was the first. Sterling followed a day later, having dug his family out of a single remaining room of their collapsed house. He offered no excuses, just a quiet, broken statement. "We're finished. Everything, gone." He looked at her simple, functional home, which had cost her less than the price of his prize ball. "You were right. God help me." "You were right." Abigail did not say, "I told you so." She did not need to. She simply opened her door and let them in, offering them hot stew and the silent, unassailable warmth of her home. The folly became the ark. For 2 weeks, it sheltered 27 survivors from Providence Flats. They slept in shifts on the warm stone floor, sharing the food Abigail had methodically preserved, their initial disbelief slowly giving way to a profound, humbling respect. They saw the intelligence of the design firsthand, the way the air circulated without a draft, the incredible efficiency of the stove, the deep, abiding security of the earthen walls. They had mocked her for digging a hole, now they understood she had crafted a sanctuary. When the thaw finally came and the true extent of the devastation was revealed, the town did not so much rebuild as it rethought. Davies, his old certainty gone, became Abigail's most devoted student. He did not build dugouts, but he began incorporating her principles into his new designs, orienting houses to the south, using stone and earth as thermal mass, understanding the brutal logic of the wind. The houses of the new Providence Flats were lower, sturdier, and smarter. They were no longer monuments to pride, but humble acknowledgments of the power of nature. Abigail Morgan never sought recognition. She lived out her days in the borough, her quiet life undisturbed except for the constant, respectful stream of visitors who came to see the house that had saved the town. The name Morgan's Folly was never spoken again. It became, simply, the Morgan Place, and later, the founder's house. Years after she was gone, laid to rest on the bluff above her home with Kaiser buried at her feet, the town council commissioned a small bronze plaque. They didn't place it in the town square. They set it in a large stone near the entrance of her home. It didn't list her accomplishments or praise her foresight. It read, Abigail Morgan. She listened to the land. The land kept her safe. It was a testament not to a structure of wood or stone, but to an idea, that the deepest wisdom is not to stand against the storm, but to understand the earth on which it falls, and to build a home so in tune with its rhythms that the wind itself does not know it is there.